Hello, I'm Jeff, Executive Vice President here at Amoco Brent. Over 100 years ago, my grandfather founded Amoco. Today, my brother and I carry on his legacy. Our team works diligently to bring you the best clays, glazes, equipment, and more for your studio and classroom. This week's episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Please find your favorite Amoco or Brent product at your local distributor today. Thank you for choosing Amoco for all your clay and glaze needs.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 468 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Rosti Eismont. For decades, he was an art director and graphic designer for major magazines and publications, including over 30 years at the Studio Potter. To see examples of his ceramic painting and design work, you can check out his website, which is eismont.com. Before I get to that episode, I wanted to thank the folks that have donated to our spring fund drive. I'd like to thank Joy Chadwick and Michael Schultz for their contributions. And if you feel like making a contribution, you can do that at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. First, let's start talking about your pre-design, pre-clay life and how you started off, because I was listening to an interview with you and you talked about being a refugee as a child and how that informed the way you think about the objects around you. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, initially, I was born in Austria, and I was born in 1945 in September 11th. My parents were in a small... a small wagon train moving at night from Yugoslavia to a British refugee camp in Austria. I was born on the way to that. I was delivered by a veterinarian. I was born with club feet. So I spent the 3 months, at 3 months of age, I believe it was. For 3 months, I was in a hospital with both of my ankles were operated on to straighten my feet to some degree. We lived in this camp for 5 years. In 1950, we came to the United States. We were sponsored by the Tolstoy Foundation. This was Katerina Tolstoy, the granddaughter, I believe, of Leo Tolstoy. These were supporters of White Russians. My father was a White Russian, as opposed to the Red Russians, who are the Bolsheviks and communists. So we grew up, we moved to Rockland County, just outside New York City. Just grew up there, and I actually had another operation on my left ankle at 7 years of age. So we lived in a house with no electricity, no water. It was a bare roots, bare bones kind of place. So that's the early... we came to this country as DPs, and I remember having a DP card, and I keep looking for it, wondering whatever happened to it. It's a big yellow card with D and a P on it. So
Is that displaced person?
Displaced person, right. So that's where we are. We were displaced persons.
And so your original nationality was from Yugoslavia? Or what was then?
Well, my father was Russian. He was a refugee from Russia when he was 9. His father was in the army of the Tsar, and subsequently he was imprisoned by the Bolsheviks. My father, at 9 years of age, moved with his mother to Bulgaria. So he grew up in Bulgaria, in a Russian enclave. And then my mother was born in Croatia, and which was pre-Yugoslavia, that area. So Croatia, Serbia, and
Herzegovina.
Yeah. So they've got Eastern and Western Christian and then Islam as well, all in that same place. And they all lived well together until, as with any place, politicians took over. So we're not in favor of politicians anywhere.
What cultural identity did your parents instill in you as a child being in the U.S.?
None. My parents were struggling themselves and struggling as refugees, struggling. My father was originally a chemist, trained as a chemist at a higher level in Europe, but when he came to this country, he couldn't get a job as a chemist, even though one of the largest chemical literally laboratories was nearby. He couldn't get a job there for one reason or another, but so he became a house painter. And at 35 or 36 years of age at that time, he actually didn't drive. So what he would do is walk to a job. If he had to take a ladder, he would carry the ladder however many miles it took to get there, and then later take a bus with his paint cans. So it was a pretty rudimentary kind of approach to a life. As we came to this country, I think my mother was pregnant, and so my youngest brother, my next in line brother, was born just as we arrived, essentially. We arrived in March of 51 or 50, and he was born in May of 50.
As you were growing up, when did you realize that creativity was an outlet for you?
It wasn't so much creativity. My mother saved some drawings that I had done, so there was some semblance of perception of art as a way of performing in the world. I'm not sure performing is the right word, but I realized when I was 8 years old, in third grade, that I was going to be responsible for myself because of my parents' inability to really grasp the American world. As much as they wanted us to be a part of that, they didn't want us to be they didn't want us to be Russian. They wanted us to be Americans. To that end, in the third grade, my report card was sent home by my teacher, Mrs. Sage, and in it she made a comment about my being shy. And I asked my mother, what is that word? I had no idea, nor did she. We didn't have a dictionary. There was no internet. So they just kind of left it alone. But I realized at that point, somehow or other, that I was going to have to find out what this word meant and how it would eventually impact my... these are all obviously in retrospect. I wasn't thinking that deeply at the time. I'm 8 years old, So I realized that I was going to be responsible for myself. My father was a hardworking painter, and he would come home and go lie down. He was just exhausted all the time. He was already in his either late 30s or he was born in 1908, so was in the 40s or so at that point. So
Yeah, I think for children of immigration, whether, like in your case, literally you were born as you were traveling from one to the other, but I've heard this from other folks that I've talked to, that their parents were immigrants, is how you are taught the idea of belonging. Whether that's you belong to a nation, whether you belong to a family. What age did you start to feel like you had a sense of identity as a person in the world?
that is a tough question.
Oh, and an evolving question, I'm sure.
It's evolving, and I'm thinking my first response is, okay, I think it was last year. And in fact, one of the recent choices, close in terms of being 77 at this point, and considering, well, I've never considered retiring because as an artist, I was so confused by hearing other artists say they were retiring. It just didn't make any sense to me, and it doesn't make any sense to me for myself. I'd love that Warren McKenzie was making pots. He may have died on the wheel. I don't know, but I know that there is a need. There was a need for him to be making pots. They may not have been good pots at that point, but the whole idea of the doing was what's important. I think that I've been trying to read Beckett's stories about nothing, and in it and his own biography called "I Must Go On, I Can't Go On." It's this constant issue of the struggle of being, and I think that it's not being an artist, it's about being thoughtful and wondering what to do next, how to do it, what it means to be someone who is involved in things around you, whether it's building a house, whether it's making a pot, whether it's painting a painting, whether it's doing your plumbing, whether it's trying to avoid all of the hammer marks around the nail. All of those things, or maybe you wanted to have all of those. I remember when I was with John Glick, that one of the jokes about the Detroit carpenters was seeing all of the rosettes around the hammer, the nail. They called it the Chicago Rosette, as a demeaning reference to Chicago carpenters. So there's a lot of strange stuff in my head, in memory of all of these things. So.
Well, that's good. Well, what you're talking about is being engaged, like being passionately engaged in something.
So. Yeah.
And we're going to jump around in your biography. So I think a lot of people will know you from the work you did at Studio Potter, which was art direction and design. You've been an active clay maker throughout that time, or parts of that time, and then also a painter. Do you think of yourself as a potter who paints and does design, or a design, do you divide them up in any way in your head when you think about your creative life?
I only divide them up when I'm doing them. I don't think that there is in any way a separation. It's when you make a pot, you got to be there making the pot. When you're painting, you got to be there making the painting. When you're working in the garden, digging for planting your bulbs in the fall for springtime, you're doing that. That the doing is when you're doing it. I mean, there's no other time. If you there was something that just came up to my mind about the time to do something is, if it's yesterday, you can't do it. If it's tomorrow, you can't do it. If it's today, you can. So that's what you do. The day is when it happens.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention gardening. That's the other thing that's been a huge passion. But these things have really different timelines. So gardening can be a years-long pursuit. Like you're planting this year to create change in the future. Studio potter, same way. Like that's the fastest that would be is a 6-month cycle. But pots and painting are a much shorter cycle.
It can be. I mean, Hans Koper only made 200 pots a year, so that's a lot of time between the making and the final firing. So I don't think that the distinction of timeline, unless you're involved in production pottery, then you have a different timeline. I was never interested in production pottery. I was one of the best things I learned from Warren was, when you make of the, let's say you have 7 or 8 or 9 balls of clay, that those balls of clay turn into 8 or 9 cousins. They're not exact duplicates of one another. And I've always liked that idea. And that was one of the difficulties for me is trying to make pots was in the 70s, there was a big move towards production pottery on a level that I just could not do. And I wasn't interested in it. So, and subsequently, I couldn't have the galleries. There weren't any galleries. There were, craft shops, and they would want you to be production oriented. It wasn't my game.
As we've talked before, you mentioned that you were at Penland in the 70s, in the or was that early 70s?
It was from 1973 to 76.
Can you talk about what was going on at Penland at that time?
I moved into the barns, and across from me was Jane Hatcher. In the big studio was Cindy Bringle, and in the little studio next to me was Jack Neff. And then as we introduced ourselves, I learned that Jack had studied with, I'm going to forget the name, but he studied with a painter at the Art Students League in New York. Jack had also worked at Con Ed in New York, so he was a street guy, sort of. And Jack and I got into just talking about painting and art, as opposed, we were both production. He was more of a production potter than I, but the two of us were completely different from, the rest of what was going on there. And for me, the best thing that happened was that the upstairs place in the barn was empty. I discovered large-scale painting, and I made they were all paintings that I stapled to the floor, and the canvas was stapled to the floor. And so I did these large-scale paintings. I still have them rolled up. I don't think I've sold any of them, but they were, I call them the Rhone Mountain series. 8 by 12, 8 by 14. They're really big things. So that sort of resurrected my paintings interest. Jack was really interested in, and so, coincidentally, he sort of looked like Van Gogh. And he started growing weed, and we indulged a bit. And in that dry county that Mitchell was, they didn't say anything about, I think smoke was allowed. So,
yeah, that's almost tobacco country too.
Right.
So they're probably used to that. When you think about folks like, let's say Cynthia Bringle, who you mentioned, like she really has stayed there. Like that has been a major part of her life, is being in the Penland community. And you've moved around a bunch, and we're going to kind of jump into different eras. But you worked with John Glick as his apprentice at one point. Was that before or after Penland? Before.
It was a year before Penland.
Can you talk about creating or coming to a sense of aesthetics in clay and what you're interested in now?
That has developed over time, I think that Warren had a greater influence than John did. My love of John's work has to do with not his forms, but the depth of painting quality that he was playing with. And I think the idea of play for him was about the glazing, and form was a secondary aspect. With Warren's work for me similarly was difficult, because there are some really great pots he made, and he made a lot of dumpers. There's doesn't, and same thing with John. I mean, all of us do that. The smart ones throw away the dumpers. You don't want them. And I think that's where Hans Koper was smart. He said he made 200 pots. He probably made 2,000, but only to save 200.
When you think about your aesthetic, we're sitting in your home now, and when I look at your work, and we've been walking around looking at your collection and the pots you've bought over the years of other people, there is a similarity between the pots you make, the pots you've bought, in this home. At dinner, we were talking about that you could call it wabi-sabi, like that the Japanese philosophy of that. But I think it's more specific than that. So when you think about like how the pots you like and the pots you make fit into this home, how do you think about that?
Essentially, what happened at some point, and I don't know what the specific point in time is about that, but I read about or saw pictures of Alexander Calder's home studio in France and his home studio in Roxbury, Connecticut. And I was just enthralled by the sense of place that this artist chose to occupy and be surrounded by. Coincidentally, there was a book in the 60s that I discovered called Handmade Houses, The Wood Butcher's Art. It was about all these houses built by hippies in the Northern California locations. After that, I found a book, fairly fancy book, and I can't remember the publisher, but it's all on artists' homes of the suburbs of New York. It was Rockland County and Westchester County and southern Connecticut. Recently, a new book came out called Artists' Homes as well. And in that, visiting houses of artists has been really an intriguing experience, in that seeing how they fashioned their environment to be an extension of their life thinking, their life, sort of a dream. There's a book called In Praise of Shadows, which is by an architect, a Japanese architect, about Japanese houses and the essence of reflective light that I just love, because it talks about the same kind of not high light, but low light and soft light and just natural window light. And those things all seem to resonate with a kind of, it just seems so nice. I don't know how to describe it beyond that. I mean, at this age, it's a space of comfort. And that comfort is one that I've designed this house. Our house originally, the oldest part of it is built in pre-1750. And over the years, I've added on to it and modified parts of it. And what I've tried to do is make it appear that each new section was consistent with the potential that would have happened at the time historically as it was built. There's a book called Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn, which is about houses that are connected to barns in Maine and northern New Hampshire, and the way it was built, that those houses were built was so you didn't have to go out in the wintertime, and you go through all of the alleys. I like that thinking. There are a number of other books on. I'll think about them in a second, but there are two books by another architect that I really liked very much about the premise of buying a piece of land and not building anything for about a year, but going there and camping and getting a sense of the place and sort of then eventually building. Our house here has developed over time, and I think that the pots, the paintings, all reflect the same kind of attitude of understanding of time and what you want to see, what I want to see in a pot, a piece of furniture, a painting is evidence of a certain kind of struggle and a resolution of that struggle. Sometimes I want to see the struggle left, and painters who paint that way, potters who make pots that way, are rare, and I think that's they're getting the short end of the stick for that.
And I think sometimes the instinct is to hide the struggle in the same way you mentioned, like if Hans Koper really made 400 pots and only showed 200, they threw the rest away. But I think there is something in the wood fire pots that I see that you've collected and you make, and you have a wood kiln here at your house. It is about a process, like you're initiating a process and taming the process in a way, but there's a lot of process left in the pots, or at least in the collection you showed me today, which I think is interesting. I think potters were all into process.
Well, they have to be. I mean, that's the nature of it. The key to me is allowing the process to become a component of the work. For instance, I bought an electric wheel from Henry Okamoto. This was a Soldner gear drive electric wheel. I bought it sometime in the early 70s, I think, or maybe late 70s. I've probably put 25 hours on it. 25 hours is not a lot of pots. I work on a treadle wheel mostly. It was both John Glick and Warren both worked on treadle wheels. Different kinds of treadle wheels. John's was a heavy flywheel. Warren's was a light flywheel. But both of them allow for a certain kind of nuance that is lost when you work on an electric wheel. And that level, that's part of the process, is allowing a certain nuance. Even slower would be obviously a Japanese-style kick wheel, but I've tried that, and I don't seem to have the ability to do my feet and my hands. It's a struggle to keep in motion. So.
One more question about your home, and then we'll move on to graphic design. But in another interview, I heard you talk about that because you came to the U.S. as a displaced person, making objects, making art was a way to ground. I don't know if you said it exactly this way, but that it was a way to ground yourself in a sense of place. Do you think that continues today, or do you think that was the past you? Like, can you talk about that as a philosophy?
I think that what may have been at the time, the reference is I perceived being a refugee, being a displaced person, I felt, and I don't know if this is true of all displaced people, all refugees, but I felt that I had no history. And part of my desire to, and I think this has to be a connection to being an artist. An artist is a person who depends on history to a degree. Whether it's painting with the pots, I mean, we're looking at Momoyama pots, and we're looking at ancient Greek pots. We're looking at paintings from the Renaissance. We're looking at paintings that we admire from 200 years ago. So everything is somewhat history dependent. I felt that I didn't have a history, and that these particular venues were potentially a way to enter into establishing a personal history. Coincidentally, this is a sort of a parallel to the history issue, and it has to do with that ceramics are that thing that has told us of the history of a race. That's what's left. So that was a thinking involved there. There's also another parallel, and it has to do with age. And I'm hoping that there's that opportunity to reach. This is a parallel to the history concept, but it has to do with what I once read about the age at which people reach their prime. We know tennis players, for the most part, reach their prime in their 20s, or maybe late teens, early 20s. Gymnasts are in their teens. Long distance runners used to be in their late 20s and their 30s. Well, of all of them, painters, artists reach their prime in their 80s. So sadly, except for Frank Stella, who managed to do it at 22 with MoMA, but for the most part, those who die before 80 are kind of out of luck. So we're hoping that we can reach that opportunity. So.
Well, being in this home and seeing the objects, I mean, so much of this visit today was interviewing you, but also it was our mutual love of pots. And we spent 2 hours going around your house looking at pots, which was really fun. But when I think about the aesthetics of wood fire, it's often looking almost with a nostalgia to the past. But then I think about your design work, some of it is so contemporary. And I think about like different studio, you were looking at a particular studio potter that you designed, and you were explaining the rationale behind having, basically you were making conceptual art through graphic design on a studio potter magazine, which is such a different feeling than making a wood fire pot. So do you think that, like, how do you compare your graphic design and your clay work? Do you think about one being more or less contemporary?
Well, I think that the issue of contemporary wood fire is a separate one. I don't think I know there are a couple of wood fire potters who have names and who are working, exploring their work in a more sculptural way. To me, that's I think they're missing the point. I think the wood fire opportunities are somewhat different, because the wood kiln is a tool. It's not an end in and of itself. It can be, I suppose, but I don't. The form it's a form and result that have to play with one another. It's with graphic design. I was involved in graphic design, and the history of graphic design is a much shorter one than it is than the ceramic history. So we're playing with a different set of tools. They're really not. I don't think that they're comparable. My approach to them, I think, is so. I mean, I'm interested in clay for the material that it is. With design, I'm interested in the thought that it is. Now, the thought can also be applied to the making of a pot, of a form, of whatever your methodology is in terms of a clay artist. And I think that being a clay artist is more. I'm not a ceramicist. I think I'm an artist who happens to work and appreciate what the possibilities of clay can do. I think back. I mean, one of the things that I combined in publishing and in ceramics is that when I was art director of Horizon magazine, I was able to get the one of the editors there to buy into an idea I had, and that was to present in that publication sort of an overview of the ceramic scene at the time. This was in 1977, I think. And Horizon was the first national consumer magazine to publish an article on clay. This is outside of, Craft Horizons was around, Ceramics Monthly was around, but they were a dedicated audience. Consumer magazines go to the general audience, and we had Glick in there, we had Volkos, we had Larry Poons, we had Mary Frank. There's a range of what clay was doing at the time by many different people. But it was an important, I think it was an important thing to have happen. And I feel, really good that I had the opportunity to be involved in it.
Can you list the magazines you've worked for over the years?
I started at Red Book magazine. I was a co-art director at True magazine. I was the art director of Essence, which is a black women's magazine. I was an art director of a new magazine called Your Place for a very short time. The art director and the editor and I were both beginners, and there was something that she was unhappy with and felt uncomfortable about what I was doing in terms of color, and had to let me go. So. Then the Horizon. I was art director of Harper's Weekly, which was a reader-written newspaper, and actually had some interesting public encouragement. I don't know if the word is right. See, I worked for Sam Antipet. Antipet had a small design studio doing a lot of publishing work. I designed the Boston Phoenix news. It's a newspaper similar to the Village Voice, but in Boston, and I designed that logo and the format for it in 1977, and they used that logo right into the early 2000s. So that was a nice little treat to see that around for so many years. So, and also I worked for Morgan and Morgan book publishers. I did a lot of design work, books for them. Yeah, so there's been a lot of stuff there.
And then Studio Potter for 30 plus years.
Well, Studio Potter for 35 years, yeah. I treated one of the foundations of it was that we never showed pots on the cover. Or not as a pot, but maybe a detail of a pot or something, or some other reference to what the content of that issue would be. So it's, I in the same way that Jerry felt that it was an important vehicle for transmitting a certain kind of thinking. I thought that my design approach was something that reflected that same thinking. We only had over 35 years, we had one disagreement. And I know that he was wrong. It happened to be with a dual issue. That is, we split the issue into two parts. The one part was an extended conversation with Peter Vulkos, and the other part happened to be with I can't remember. I know their name. It's a very common. She's lived in Ojai. This potter, Beatrice Wood. That's what it was. At any rate, that issue, I wanted to have the Vulkos's words presented in sort of a concrete poem format, and he wanted it to be much more simplistic. And I think that what I had heard Vulkos speak and demonstrate, and I think that the words were sort of died in the presentation that we finally did. They just didn't have any life to them. And I was interested in having them have life. I mean, for instance, there's an issue on California Potters that was on the cover of the California Potters. We did a photograph of Richard Shaw sent us a photograph of himself eating a sandwich while he's in an orchestra. And we put that orchestra photograph, I think it was in a bed of sand in a studio in New York, and then had a Anchor Steam can and red sunglasses and a bunch of other things that were sort of California related for this photograph. In the conversation that Jerry had developed for that particular issue, the conversation was between Jerry and the protagonist was there's a name that it was John Glick anyway, and so but it was supposed to be John Glick's writing. John Glick was a lefty, and I did the whole interview in my own hand, using my handwriting, but writing it in a sort of a backwards John Glicky kind of way, including all the errors. I just crossed them out and just continued writing. So I wanted to have that kind of sense of immediacy of the thing. So that was one of the more interesting early explorations. I mean, one of the people will never get any of this stuff. The issue on money, the cover of the issue on money was the money plant. So we're combining now gardening and graphic design and that thinking. But we also printed that issue in green ink. Again, I tried to get actual recycled money paper, but they didn't make it anymore. But in that issue, I designed the columns of type to have a empty center. The two columns of type actually were a metaphor for the World Trade Center. So if you see that issue and look at it, now you'll see that these two columns are representative of the World Trade Center, the old World Trade Center, not the new one, the one that was demised. So anyway, there that kind of thinking. There's one issue that was about, I think it was on computers or something, but I designed that one so that each alternate article was either on a black page or on a white page. So when you then, if you looked at the edge of the issue, the magazine, you would see a breakup of that's white and black, like the scanning device, that for pricing.
Right, like a barcode.
A barcode, right. So I mean, those are personal ways of introducing life to most people. Nobody would understand it or appreciate it or care about it, but as a design device, I kept trying to think of how to bring it into the present, as much as possible.
Well, it's interesting because before we talked about how Studio Potter in and of itself is a relatively small audience versus, like, let's say Harper's Weekly, massive audience for a long time. So do you think your ability to take risks, could you take big swings at Harper's Weekly? or were you working in very small parameters because you had to for a broader audience?
No, the issue with Harper's Weekly was not Harper's Magazine. Harper's Weekly was a reader-written newspaper.
Oh, okay,
right.
It
was a sideline, and it had a small audience as well. However, our timeline was 2 weeks. Studio Potter's is 6 months. So coming out twice a year, that's a different schedule, and it allowed for a much broader way of approach. I mean, a current publication that I think is comparable might be a Sopus. I don't know if you know a Sopus magazine. It's an art magazine, and I wanted Studio Potter was like. Because it dealt with an artist's life of a certain kind, I think it had I wanted it to have that character. In my first issue was also, I designed a logo, I hand painted it to reflect a sense of the craft of the stone cutter who's cutting in letters into some kind of monument. When Mary Barringer took over, I took the same information, the same structure of the Studio Potter, the studio and the word Potter, but I used a typeface that was designed in the 20s by Eric Gill. Gill Sans is the font, and I wanted it to reflect this change in culture, because Mary's approach was considerably different from Jerry's. It was in many ways, Jerry didn't know things, he knew parts of the world, but not in totality. Even though he was a world-traveled personality, he tended to be sort of introspective. I didn't feel Mary wasn't as involved in the magazine in that way. To her, it was a job. To Jerry, it wasn't a job. It was his life, and I think that distinction also carried over when Mary limited herself to a 10-year tenure. I think that was reflective of her perception of it being just a job. Eleanor, who took over from Mary, similarly didn't seem to think of it as an important part of the history of the magazine itself. It was a job for her as well. I think. I mean, we've never talked about it because we kind of left with our chemistries didn't match. So that's where it was a sad ending for me. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think also this happens when someone's life's work is to start something, passing that on to the next person is really difficult, and often those transitions don't really go well. And I actually wanted to end the interview thinking about your life transitions now. You guys have lived here for a long time, but you're in the process of selling parts of your collection. You're downsizing as you get older in the hopes of a move overseas. So can you talk about this phase in your life? Just the general thoughts you have about downsizing, not collecting, but deaccessioning, and what that means for you?
I think the most difficult part of the accessioning is that the pots I've collected are there because of a certain kind of intimacy that I've been a car guy for years. From 1956, my first Carcraft Hot Rod and Custom magazine. I started collecting magazines and then cars. Finally, when I was 50, I had some money, and I could actually have the car of my dreams, the 32 Ford Roadster. It was an old hot rod. We drove it around for 10 years. We had some great times with it, and then we got to the point where the idea of building this car for the audience, me, was going to be require a car to tow it in, another truck to tow it in, a trailer to tow it in, a paint job that was going to be such that I'd be afraid anybody could go near it and scratch it. It was ridiculous, and so I started selling off all of my interest in cars, and that was a pretty freeing experience. The pots are a little more difficult because there's so many. We're sitting here in front of 20 or 30 pots made by Ruggles and Rankin, dear friends of mine from Penland and later. Each one of them, I can see them making them. I can see them using them. These are more difficult to remove from my grasp. But at the same time, I know that there's this, nobody gets out of here alive, and in that same vein, you can't take it with you. Where are you gonna, where's it gonna go? My kids they've got their own lives and struggles, and maybe they could use these, but they don't have the connection to them that I have, and I don't think I can transfer that awareness. I certainly have made enough of my own art that they need to be struggling with to either use or sell, or who knows what to do with. But I think that a collection, what does it mean to be a collector? What does it mean to hold on to things? I don't know. I'm at that stage of at 77, as I mentioned earlier. I've got this one memory that my father died at 81 of a massive heart attack, and I recently had some heart issues that required a stent, several stents, and having high blood pressure. That's an inheritance, I guess. Not sure how to dissipate that. I know that two friends, two potters, recently had to go through a similar kind of closing down their studios. Malcolm Wright and John Glick both spent several years closing down their studios and selling and downsizing their collections. John sadly passed away prior to him. I mean, he moved to California, but then he died soon after. but his collection is now in his wife's hands, and she's struggling what to do with it. So she suggested that don't leave your wife with your problems.
Those are wise words.
Right, yeah, we're working on it, so yeah.
Well, a lot of the things we've talked about, people can see on your website, and they can see examples of your design and your work. Can you just leave that website so people could check it out?
Well, the home page, eismont.com, that's EISMONT.com, has a big paragraph talking about some of the things that are in process or I've done. And there are highlighted words there, and each of those highlighted words is a link to either an example of a flip book that I've designed or to my Instagram page. And the Instagram page has watercolors, some oils, and some pots and gardens, some garden images. There's tons of stuff on there. There's a Facebook page, which I periodically upload new information. So I'm sort of social in that respect. No, it's I think it's a good site. I learned how to build websites from a dear friend, and that's an old school old HTML site. So if you've got a smartphone, it might not be easy to access it there. It's better on an iPad or on a desktop.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for having me to your home. It's been a real pleasure to spend some time with you.
Oh, my pleasure for sure. It's been a treat.
I'd like to thank Rosti for having me over to his place. I got to do this interview in person, which doesn't happen very often, so I appreciate his warmth and generosity. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on this show or any of the other ones on the Brickyard Network, you can get in touch through our network website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.